Hi there and welcome back. My name is Nicole with morningchores.com. Today is the first video in a series of videos all about preparedness, how to prepare for difficult life situations. So in today's video, we'll be giving an introduction and defining what preparedness is, talk about why we would want to do this, talk through some real life scenarios, and then I'm going to give my top 10 category list of supplies. Just give a brief overview because we'll be going into more detail on that supply list in the upcoming videos. First, let's define what preparedness is. In my words, preparedness is planning ahead for difficult situations. Now, why would we want to prepare for these difficult situations that may or may not potentially happen? Well, reason number one is I think it is good stewardship. As human beings, we need to take responsibility for ourselves, our families, and our actions and how we consume. So I think it's important to plan ahead for potential situations so that you can take more responsibility for those things that happen as they're happening to you. The second reason is it makes a stressful situation less stressful when you're a little more prepared. I like to use the airbag scenario. When you're driving in the car, it's good to know that that airbag is there and ready to go. Of course, you don't ever want to use it, but when the airbag does pop out and save your life, you're thankful that it's there. That's kind of a situation of preparedness, where the airbag is there in case you need it. You hope you never have to use it, but when you do need it, you're thankful that it's there and that it was available to you. Now let's talk about some realistic situations or scenarios that may come your way that would encourage you to be prepared or give you a reason to prepare. And I think this is going to depend on a lot of factors and be very different from person to person. Number one, it's going to depend on your geographical location in the world, which we'll talk about here in a minute. It's also going to depend on personal factors. For example, are you married? Do you have children? Are you taking care of an elderly relative or parent? All of these things are going to determine what you prepare for and what kind of items you're going to need in your supply list. So number one is weather. I think no matter where you live in the world, you are up against some kind of weather anomaly, whether it's earthquakes, hurricanes. In my case, we can have severe storms from winter storms to summer storms that may involve tornadoes. So this is going to depend on where you live. So for me, I don't need to prepare for hurricanes, but I do need to prepare for severe thunderstorms, snowstorms, and tornadoes. Second realistic scenario would be power outages. And again, this depends on where you live. So if you live in a location where they're doing frequent brownouts, this is something that you're going to have to deal with on a regular basis. So you're going to need those supplies handy and ready to go all the time. Where I live, the power very rarely goes out. If it does go out, it usually flicks off and then back on right away. I think the longest the power was out, aside from storm related, was about 2 hours, and that's something that I can easily handle. Now, we did have the power out for 3 days a couple of years ago because we had a series of severe storms come through and knock out power lines. So I definitely have supplies on hand where I can be without power for more than 3 days. So when the power just flickers off and back on, I can handle that. So pay attention to power outages and how frequently they're happening in your area. Another realistic scenario is job loss. Now, I pray this doesn't happen to anybody, but it is a potential thing that could happen. And this type of preparedness would have to do more with your finances. So let's say a job is lost in the household and it directly affects your income. How long can you survive paying your bills without a job? So maybe 3 months, 6 months, and of course this would be eliminating all those luxury items like cable and eating out. So if you just pare down your bills down to the bare minimum, how much money do you need per month to survive? And maybe try to keep that much money in your savings account so that if that ever happened, you would be prepared to handle it. Another scenario would be illness. And again, I hope this doesn't happen to anybody, but how many times has everyone been sick in your house, especially kids, and you go to get cough syrup out of your medicine cabinet and you're completely out or it's expired. And then you have to run to the store while everybody's sick and you may be feeling run down, or like you're coming down with it and you're having to go out to the store to buy the stuff you need in order to get it to your family. So illness is one of those things where I think it's really easy to be prepared ahead of time. So for example, one of the things that I do is every 6 months I go through our medicine cabinet. I evaluate all the medicine, expiration dates, what I'm low on, and I try to get those things on hand before anybody gets sick. And same thing with other items like Sprite, chicken noodle soup, crackers, some of my herbs that I like to use for illness. I try to make sure all those things are on hand before everybody gets sick, so that way when I'm taking care of people and trying to help them feel better, I'm not having to go out and run to the store. Everything's already here. Before I get into my supply list, I just want to mention again here that I will be going into way more detail on this supply list in the next couple of videos. I'll be giving you actual quantities of what you need, as well as some tools you can use to calculate what you need specifically for your family. So this is just a brief overview. And before I get into the specific categories, I want to mention two things that I try to kind of keep in mind as I'm going through this list. The first thing is with each category, I always like to have 3 sources for each thing. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail, but just to give you an example, with water, I want 3 different ways that I can get water. The other thing I want to keep in mind here is when you start to go through this category, a good place to start, especially if you have never tried to prep or be prepared for difficult situations and have supplies on hand, a good baseline to start with is 3 days. Try to acquire 3 days worth of supplies to get you through whatever scenario, a power outage, an illness, a bad storm comes through. You know, sometimes we get snowstorms where we can't leave the house for a couple of days, or it's just not safe to. So have 3 days of supplies of water, food, etc. to get you through. Start there, and then you can build from there, because it can be really overwhelming to think, how am I going to get 6 months worth of food, in the house? To me, that's really overwhelming. So begin with 3 days, and then you can build from there. My categories for my supply list are water, food, shelter, fire, first aid, light, security, toiletries and cleanliness, tools, and entertainment. So let's go back and briefly explain each one of those. The first one is water. Obviously, water is very, very important, and this is something you need to think about. Do you have 3 days worth of water supplied in your house? Now, if you live in the city and the power gets shut off, more than likely you will still have running water. But I live in the country, I'm on well water, so if we lose power, I do not have running water. So what can I do to make sure that I have water available to me? And again, we want at least 3 different sources. So one thing I've done is I have water stored in the basement, ready to go. Number 2, we installed a hand pump on our well, so we can actually manually pump water out of our well without electricity. And number 3, I can catch rainwater, and I have a filtration system where I can filter that water. Those are 3 ways that I can access water. The next category is food, and I feel like you could have a whole video, probably a whole series of videos just on food storage for preparedness. Again, just start with the 3 days worth, and I'll give you some tools on how to calculate how much you need in quantities in the next video. But you want to keep in mind of storing food that doesn't require electricity. So it doesn't require a refrigerator, a freezer. You want to look at canned goods, dried goods, things with a little bit longer of a shelf life too. Number 3 is shelter. This one's pretty obvious, and most of us have homes or apartments to live in, and that consists of your shelter. But do you know how to build a shelter quickly if you had a tarp and some rope? Do you have a tent on hand? This goes back to my 3s. Always have at least 3 ways to acquire something. And in this case, shelter, a tent, a tarp, and your house or your apartment is sufficient. Number 4 is fire, and I separated fire from light because I think they both need separate categories. Fire is good for heat, keeping warm, it's good for cooking, It's good for sterilizing and purifying, and of course it also provides light as well. But one thing that we don't really think about sometimes is how are we going to stay warm? So if you live in an area that gets really cold weather, getting cold happens very easily and very quickly, and it's not only detrimental to your health, but it is a psychological factor as well. If you've ever been camping and it's just rained the whole time and you're just cold and damp, there's nothing worse than feeling cold and damp for several days. So there is something psychologically uplifting about having a fire. So you need to think about, where can you have a fire? If you're in an apartment, do you have a patio? How are you going to stay warm without power? Now I know there's a lot of options with solar, and that's something you can look into if you live in the city, especially an apartment. But if you live, somewhere where you have some property, do you have space to have a fire pit outside in the yard? But then you need to consider, what if it's raining and the wind is really, really strong and you can't have a fire? Do you have somewhere where you can have a fire underneath some kind of structure where it's still safe? What about inside your house? Do you have a fireplace, a wood stove? All of these are things to consider with staying warm. Category number 5 is first aid. Just have basic supplies on hand to begin with. Band-aids, Neosporin, hydrogen peroxide. I like to use colloidal silver. Also having things like gauze and spraying wraps, maybe even a sling or tourniquets. Having all these things on hand as a baseline is really helpful. And just be observant about what you use in your regular life. I have kids, so they're getting scraped knees and things like that. So just having those things on hand, and then you can always build later from there. Number 6 is light. Light, again, is very important. You don't realize how dark it gets until the power goes out. Now, I live out in the country, so it's already dark. We don't have street lamps or anything like that, but it is really dark at nighttime. So having a way to obtain light is really important. And again, my 3s, so have candles, oil lamps, flashlights, headlamps are also very helpful, because if you have to go outside and do something, having a headlamp but your hands free is really helpful. So take into consideration all the different methods you can acquire light. Things like matches, batteries, all those things are helpful in this category. Number 7 is security. And this could be anything from taking self-defense classes to having mace or different methods of protecting yourself on hand and ready to go. Now, granted, if the power's out for a couple of hours to a couple of days to a week, you may not have a need for any of this. But if you were in a really serious situation where the power was out for a month, or there's other situations that could potentially be threatening, then you need to have things in place so that you can protect yourself and your family. Number 8 is toiletries and cleanliness, and this is also very important. It's important to keep yourself clean, as well as your preparation areas for food prep clean. And the purpose of this is so that you're not spreading disease or sickness or illness. So you want to make sure you have things like soap and toilet paper, shampoo, conditioner, dish soap, all these types of things on hand so that you can keep things clean. That's really, really important, especially when the power goes out. Number 9 is tools, and I did put this in a separate category just because when the power goes out, you kind of need some different tools, especially if you don't have running water, or if you're having to cook on a wood cook stove or outside over a campfire. You're not going to want to use your regular pots and pans. I mean, you can if you absolutely have to, but having some cast iron on hand, having ways of washing your clothes without your washing machine or your dryer, you kind of got to think about, put yourself about 100 to 200 years back in time and kind of look at the tools that they used without electricity. And that should give you some ideas on some things you need. But some areas you might want to focus on is dishwashing, clothes washing, bathing, cooking, and processing food. Those are kind of the categories where you may need to look for some more manual style tools to get these jobs done. And my last category is entertainment. And I know some of you may be thinking that is not important for survival, but I do think it is helpful to have some things on hand in case, like For example, a couple years ago, we had a series of storms come through and we lost power for 3 days. And I had kids and I had to find ways to kind of entertain them. Now, granted, it was summertime, so we spent most of the day outside, but in the heat of the day, it got really hot for those 3 days. It was in the 80s, just high humidity. So we ended up going to the basement and, we played games, we found things to do, but I think having some things on hand is really helpful because when the power's out, you have a lot of time on your hands because you don't have the television to watch, you don't have the internet to entertain you. So having things like board games, a deck of cards, books to read, maybe some drawing paper with markers and pencils, just basic things to kind of get you through or pass the time, especially in the evenings when it's dark and there's not really a lot to do anyways. It is really helpful. And again, I think it's psychologically uplifting to kind of have those kind of fun, common things around, something to connect you all together to kind of get you through the difficult situation. I hope you found today's video helpful. I hope it's a good kind of start and baseline to our video series on preparedness. I would love to hear in the comments below, what do you guys do to prepare? Have you prepared at all, or is this something new to you? I would love to hear, so just let us know. You can also head over to morningchores.com. There's all kinds of information over there to get you more prepared, from gardening, animal husbandry, beekeeping, so much more. Lots of great information, so check that out. I hope you guys have a great week and we'll see you on the next video.